Hello and welcome to GeograPod, a podcast about geography with your host, Will Mehle. Today, we'll be talking about, for our very first episode, the importance of space and place, and how where we grow up and where we live impacts us as people, and how we then impact where we live. We're starting out with an interview with one Tucker Colvin, a master's student at the University of New Mexico, who is currently studying geography and environmental science. We will be talking about the importance of space and place. Thank you, and enjoy.
Hey, so if you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Tucker Colvin. I am a master's student in geography and environmental studies, and I just moved to Albuquerque from Montana, and one semester into my program so far. 1.5, I guess, now.
Yeah, so there's a good deal of differences between Montana and New Mexico then.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The vegetation's so much different here, just much more dry, arid landscape. In fact, actually, some places in Montana, especially where I live, don't actually get that much more rain than New Mexico, but there's just so much more evaporation from this area. It's closer south, it's high elevation, so the sun's pretty intense. So it just makes it for a much different landscape, but also the people, just much more Hispanic influence here, and that really gives the culture here much more diverse perspectives, and it just really adds to education, just because you do get those different perspectives from these different professors and different students that have different backgrounds. Come from different small towns, even a lot of Native American students, and there's quite a few professors who are Native American too, and they give a whole nother perspective much different than what you get from maybe a typical male, white-dominated faculty, which is probably the case at a lot of universities. So I think New Mexico is doing a really good job at kind of promoting those new perspectives, and it really adds a lot to the education here.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of perspectives to be found in New Mexico. How do you think growing up in Montana sort of shaped your perspective about the world?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's a lot to think about there, because growing up in Montana, a lot of people have the ideas of what Montana means to them, but it makes a big difference where you grow up in Montana, where you grow up in a town, even like what neighborhoods you live in. That really shape how you grow up, what perspectives you have. So I think growing up in Montana, I spent a lot of time out in the woods. My family loved to go outdoors, go camping, hiking, and so that's something that always was a part of what I like to do. It's a place that felt very comfortable to me. It felt like if I ever get stressed, if I go and walk around in the woods for a little bit, it's very relaxing for me. And that's not the case with a lot of people, even if they grew up in Montana. Montana is a more rural state, but you can spend all your time in the cities. Well, not that big of cities, but more urban areas. So it really depends. Like, even though you grow up in the same place, they can shape different people different ways. And for me, that meant going outdoors, going camping, backpacking, hiking, skiing. And then also, my relatives have a cattle and sheep ranch, and I went out there most summers and helped them do all kinds of moving cows and building fence and all that kind of fun stuff that goes along with it. And that's really a great opportunity that you can't experience in a lot of places either. So being in a rural place, you get to experience how people live off the land. It's not your typical 9-to-5 job. You work 7 days a week. You have to wake up early and feed all the animals. So that also gives you a different work ethic. It's really all the time.
It's more of a lifestyle. It's
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you sort of talked a little bit about like a personal connection you had with Montana that you don't think that a lot of other people had. Like, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on like how we have those, like how we develop those personal connections with the places we grow up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think spending time in different places obviously makes a big impact on you. So there's a lot of like personal agency in viewing that, how you view yourself. But I think the surrounding environment, like what you're exposed to, has a huge impact on that. So to think about like how I became who I am today, all these different factors had a huge impact on me, like my family, my friends, the natural environment. I grew up seeing bears a lot, so I'm comfortable around seeing bears, which is kind of a silly example, but it just shapes like the seeing that and having that specific relationship with things like bears, things like deer. For me, it put me into giving me a perspective where kind of humans and nature, it's not as much of a like society versus nature kind of thing. It's like more so you can see them out in their environment, but it's also our environment. We share this environment together. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that having that perspective, that's the example for me of how that has shaped who I am and shaped my views of where I am in this world and how I view it.
And that perspective you probably wouldn't have gotten even if you just grew up like a few hours away from where you did, you know, like.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's some of the places that I grew up in Helena, and then some other places, like they're much more invested in their football program, their basketball program, like in their high school. So they spend a lot more time performing those kinds of sports, where I spent more time hiking, skiing. So there's not to say either one of those are better than the other, but they do end up shaping how you view the world and your role in it and what you value as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, if you could narrow it down to one place, what is the one place that you think has affected you most as a person?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I think the easiest answer would be, the home I grew up in. And that's probably the answer for a lot of people. But I'll think of something I think maybe besides that, I would say there's a lake up in northwest Montana that my family went camping every year. And we would go up there as a family, we would canoe around, we would go on all these hikes, and we would pick huckleberries, and it became a yearly thing. So that is something that really had a huge impact on me. And it was always a thing that we did as a family, and something that we were all involved, everybody was there for, and it was one of my favorite things every summer. But we went every year when I was a family up until I was age 14, and then my dad passed away, and then it totally shifted how I view that lake and that location, because that was something that we always went to as a family, where he was part of. And so after he passed away, I still haven't actually been back there, just because I don't think it would be the same for me without him there, and it's something that I always associate with him. And so it's kind of viewing this location as a remembrance of fun times, but not only that, also remembering people that are dear to you. Huge
Yeah, sorry to
me.
hear that. There does seem to be, for a lot of people, not only just a personal tie to places, but like that places are tied to specific people, like you talked about. And
Absolutely.
That's an interesting topic to bring up. In the geography department here at UNM, we talk a little about the importance of place, and talk a little bit about why place is just important, maybe generally, not necessarily on a personal scale.
Yeah, for sure. Studying place and space is interesting because it really relates to everything. So a lot of people in this program study hugely diverse topics. I study water governance. Some other people in this department study climate, weather patterns. Some people are looking at legal protections for natural features such as rivers and lakes. So the point being that you can take geography and apply the physical aspect of it, the physical spatial aspect of it, to a whole wide variety of topics. And so space really has a lot of importance, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So space puts that context into the topic you're studying. Of this specific instance of, say, water governance happens in one location much different than the other location. The people in that location are different. The cultures in that location are different than another location, say, in Montana compared to New Mexico. So without having the aspect of space and thinking about how different spaces dictate different functions as far as human geography or physical geography, landforms and things like that, if you don't take that into account, I think you really miss a lot of the contextual basis around that research.
With water governance, like, what is the impact that water has on societies and like sort of individual places that you can observe just through your experience.
Yeah, so New Mexico specifically is actually a really fantastic place to study water governance because it means different things to so many different people. And there's also multiple water institutions in New Mexico. For example, there's the two water institutions are prior appropriation, which is the same as throughout the West, and that's whoever used the water first has the right to keep using it. And then the other one is very unique to New Mexico, and there's some legal protections in it, but it's kind of being more pushed into the prior appropriation system, but it's called the acequia system. And some people may be familiar with that, but it's more of a communally based water management. So instead of the prior appropriation system where water is governed from top-down government authority and dictating like you get to use this much water, you get to use this much water, you get to use this much water, the acequia system is horizontally managed. So it's a communally decisions on how much water people get to use. And because of those differences, it makes it so people have much different relationships with water. So the acequia system, because it is horizontal, everybody has to pitch into maintenance of the acequias are the actual irrigation ditches. That's what they're called, the acequias. So everybody has to pitch in to clean those, maintain them, and they have events that cleaning day events. So everybody makes a bunch of food. It's a big party. So it's much more of a communally, like identity-based water system. So they view water as part of their culture, part of their identity as acequia communities. And so it's really interesting to see how they view those communities, how they view themselves, as opposed to farmers who are based on the prior appropriation system, which is more governmental control. So it's kind of cool just to see the difference in people's perspective. It's not just the materiality of water that's important, it's how people view it and how they identify with water. And that is very space and place related and dependent on location.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, the whether or not the water is owned communally or by the government definitely gives you a different relationship with it. You
Absolutely.
know, like just how you interact with the land. Like that's not something I really relate to because, you know, we got all our water from the government. But if you had to physically take care of the water and like take care of the land, it would give you a maybe closer relationship with it.
Yes, absolutely. So it's kind of cool just to see those differences in a place like this, even in Albuquerque, there's both those systems are in place in Albuquerque, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, that is kind of neat. With the water systems, it sort of brings up important questions about like who owns the land, who owns the water, like, and those are things that of course we discussed in the past, but today in our culture we're also sort of grappling with those questions still.
Yeah. Oh, sure. That's always a big debate, a big topic. And there's a few ways to look at it in my perspective. There's the legal way. You can look at it like who legally owns the land, who legally owns the water. And in New Mexico, all water is owned by the state of New Mexico. And the land is owned either privately or publicly, but then you have to think about there's so many more intricacies of like mineral rights, who owns the air above your land. But there's also on top of that, there's more of a traditional or like way of using this land, using this water, so ownership doesn't necessarily isn't just the legal definition of it. It also can be who owns it as far as like who are the people that have cared for it over the years, over generations, who are the people that still benefit from that resource. And so that is also another form of ownership. And if you look at ownership that way, there becomes less clear definitions of who owns land, who owns water. Is all of Albuquerque, is it owned by the people who own the private property, or is it owned by the generations who have been here for thousands and thousands of years and who have used this land and have taken care of this land? So who has a right to claim this is ours? How do we share that? How do we share the benefits taken from this land, from this water? So it's really a complex question, and I imagine it's something that we're going to be grappling with for forever.
Yeah, there's not an easy answer to a lot of it.
Yes, absolutely.
You're sort of saying that place isn't necessarily just based on county lines. It isn't purely legal. it can also sort of be what we feel about a place, how we interact with a place. Would you say that place is based upon interaction with it, or is there a separate definition that you would use?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to think about it, like how, place is based with interaction, and a lot of those interactions are defined by things like county lines, but a lot of them are not. A lot of them are defined by, like ecoregions, for example. Different ecoregions that have similar ecosystems. We interact with them in one way, in contrast to another ecoregion, say like a riparian area by a river. We're going to interact with that much different than high up in the Sandia Mountains. And even though they can be in the same legal boundaries, they mean a lot different things to different people. And so there's lots of kind of nuances to how we interact with land based on things like that, like the ecosystem, but also our relationship with that. Like, I just moved to New Mexico, so my relationship to this land is much different than somebody from one of the pueblos who's lived here for so many generations. That creates a much different relationship to land and space, and the relationship to all the surrounding people, the surrounding pueblos, the surrounding groups of different ethnicity communities who've came here at different times. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it, and it's not as simple as having a political map with county lines, different neighborhoods, and people are moving all the time. So it's constantly changing, constantly adapting.
Yeah, the maps are only really good for the time that they're made, everything changes so quickly. We've talked a lot about personal relationships with place. Do you think there's an idea of place that is completely separate from humanity and separate from how we view a certain area?
Oh, that's interesting. So I think the idea of place for us as a Western idea of place is probably much different than how place and space is viewed in a lot of Eastern and Asian cultures. I don't know specifically how they change, but space in general is a very constructed kind of idea of this location. It's a constructed idea that it matters. It has huge influence, but it's also any idea that we kind of think about as humans, that we think about as making a difference in how we view the landscape, view any of this. It's kind of a constructed idea, space, that it dictates different things. And so if we view different cultures as having different ideas of space, they might have different relationships with distance, different ecoregions, some different sharing that space with others. We view space as this is my space, this is my private space, this is your private space. But that's private property. Having space as property, that's a constructed idea. That's not necessarily the norm throughout the world. So there's a lot of different ways to view space, different people who live there, different ways to interact and use it, and different ways to benefit from it. Is this land here to benefit us, or are we here to protect this land? So who's here for who?
Exactly, yeah. Who owns the land, that's... Yeah, you're right, there's plenty of different cultural views on what land means and how we interact with it. Well,
yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me, Tucker.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, you have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
I would like to thank Tucker Colvin for talking to me about space and place and about geography in general. This has been the very first episode of GeograPod, so be sure to check back in to get some more episodes about geography. Thank you.